Some films were harmed in the making of this podcast. Hello and welcome to the second installment of For Your Consideration's October Fright Fest Spooktacular for 2019. I am your host, Mike Josic.
And I'm your other host, Dustin Friesenab.
And if you've been keeping score, if you were here last week, you will know that, for Halloween on the show, we generally pick a theme and we kind of lean into it. This year's theme is Universal Monsters. And last week we did Dracula and Dracula Untold. We're basically taking an original Universal Monsters film and kind of doing a bit of a compare and contrast with where Universal has taken the franchise since. This week we are going to be tackling
The Wolfman and the Wolfman, given that there's a full moon. Whoa. This is a ghost sound which is not appearing in any film this year.
Now, the original Wolfman came out in 1941. It was directed by George Wagner and written by Kurt Siodmak. And while it wasn't the first Wolfman movie that Universal produced, that credit goes to Werewolf of London. That came out in 1935, and many consider it to be a superior film. But because the 2010 remake of The Wolfman was kind of
a direct remake, we decided that we'll go with the one that is the same story, sort of see how the story has been updated for contemporary times.
So, The Wolfman, Lon Chaney Jr. What did you think, Dustin? This was your first time watching it, right?
It's my first time watching both Wolfmen. Men's.
I believe the proper plural would be Wolfmans, because it's the film title. Just saying.
We'll go with werewolves, which technically...
Men of hair?
Were is actually Old English for man.
Ooh.
So technically werewolf means wolfman.
Man-wolf.
Now you're assuming grammar
now
structure.
I am. I'm making leaps.
But the basic premise of the story is a man goes home to his father's place after being gone for a good long time, sort of kicked out of the family because he was the black sheep. His brother was killed, his much favored elder brother, and he goes to sort of see what the heck's going on with that. Ends up getting attacked by a wolf while gypsies are in town, and struggles to come to terms with being a werewolf. Effectively, it's the same story in both, but we'll get into some of the differences. What I enjoyed about the original Wolfman, and to an extent the remake, is how it's not just some monster goes around slashing up some people. They bring up the origin of the words lunacy. They bring up the psychology of lycanthropy. They bring up the folklore. They give a whole lot of history and background to psychology and philosophy. They speak of the duality of man, and these are actually deeper films than you'd expect.
Apparently, Kurt Siodmak had actually researched for some time lycanthropy and dual personalities and stuff like that. He wanted to bring as much lore, reality, and dimension to the script that he could. And you could tell.
It was a huge strength of the film, for sure.
You could tell because at every opportunity, somebody would drop some encyclopedic knowledge. But yeah, I agree.
And it was done in a way which wasn't too awkward because the town was a very superstitious town, and you did have the gypsies around who knew of it.
It wasn't a Professor Van Exposition.
Exactly, because you'd have multiple people doing it, and in particular, you had Bela's wife, whose husband, of course, was a werewolf. That's actually one thing that didn't quite make much sense to me. He was killed with the silver cane, the cane which just happened to be made out of silver. But at the time, he was a wolf. He wasn't a werewolf. He was a wolf.
If you want something else to wonder about, why is he still servicing customers at night on a full moon?
It's really kind of dumb in that sense.
But yeah, it is something that I won't even say keen-eyed viewers have brought up over the years because it's not something that's really hidden. And I was listening to the audio commentary for the film. It's a film historian, and he's talking about the film and the behind-the-scenes stuff. And one of the things he comments on is the fact, why is the Bela Lugosi werewolf an actual wolf? And why is Lon Chaney Jr. walking on two legs like a man, big hairy man? It's like, don't ask me that question because There's no answer.
It seems like it's just there to add a little bit of doubt to whether or not he's a werewolf for a while. Because he was attacked by a wolf, as opposed to in the remake where he was attacked initially by a werewolf. So in the remake, he knew there's a giant Wolfman going around. And honestly, a lot of people did. And that's one of the things that we enjoyed about it. Because you had the big open attacks.
Don't get into the remake just yet.
Okay.
Another mystery of the Wolfman is after the first transformation, he's wearing his white undershirt, and then you see him prowling around as a werewolf, and he's got a nice dark collared shirt buttoned right up.
When you're going up for a night on the town, you're going to switch out of your homely white shirt and, get the button up. He was trying to woo the married woman from across the street he was spying on with a telescope.
He was.
Which is super creepy. And you're saying that, romance was different back in the day with his not taking no for an answer and being unnecessarily forward. And,
Not romance was different. Social mores were different.
Mores were different.
This was sort of... I'm not even saying that women enjoyed it at the time. I'm just saying that this was accepted behavior. There was that. If she says no, just keep asking.
If she says no, just tell her what she's going to do. When she says she's married, just say, yeah, that's fine, whatever.
But, it plays out really interestingly because when the husband when the fiancé, because they're engaged. I'm pretty sure they're engaged. It's her fiancé. But when he gets introduced, he doesn't act super jealous. And there is a love triangle sort of operating there. She clearly is interested in Lon Chaney Jr. Don't ask me why.
She does go with him when he declares, no, I'm going to meet you at 8.
She brings a safety friend.
Which is a good idea because this guy admitted to spying on you in your bedroom with a telescope.
But when her beau comes along, he introduces himself and he's not like, you get out of my house and I'm going to beat you silly. Because he's just like, I wanted to meet my competition. And he's quite confident. And there is clearly, something deeper between those two characters. And sure, maybe the entrance of Larry Talbot introduces something interesting into her world. But I like how it's played because it's not a major plot point. They never really hook up because it ends with him basically getting killed by his father. So that never gets consummated or resolved in any kind of satisfying way. So you never get the sense that it was meant to be anything more.
But it seems like it was just there so that he'd have some sort of connection to somebody that he didn't want to kill. So when the pentagram appears on their hand, he'd be like, oh crap, I should do something about this.
And it was someone to engage in the town with because when Larry came back, Larry left. He did not want anything to do with this small bohunk town.
He was gone for 20 years.
He was gone.
To go schooling like one of those prissy educated people.
And he comes back and he still thinks that these are small town folk. And I think that was sort of like his connection, even if he went about it in a kind of creepy way.
That's what you do with high-powered telescopes, right?
But that's one of those things about this movie that I find interesting. And one of the things, if you listen to our episode last week, we kind of were down on the 31 Dracula. And it was for pacing reasons, it was for staging, and there was a lot of stuff that we just didn't really connect with. And in this movie, we've listed off 3 or 4 things that are obvious, like what's going on there. But because of the strength of all of the other elements, because the actors are actually doing a decent job. Evelyn Ankers is great. Claude Rains, how can you not love Claude Rains? And there's the werewolf lore and a story that has score, has music. It has...
Bela's not just staring for hours on end.
I like him in this movie.
He's good in this movie.
He's really good in this movie. And it has narrative drive. And it's a tight, 71 or 74 minutes, whatever it is. So even though we may bring up things that we were like, what about this silly thing in the old movie?
Why would they... people are giving the gypsies crap. It's like, oh, these gypsies come around, people start getting murdered. Yeah, one of them was a werewolf who didn't take a night off every month during the full moon. That's kind of stupid. Dumbass gypsies. This is why you guys have such a bad reputation. This reason and this reason alone.
Another thing that I got a kick out of with the movie is there's that scene where all the gypsies all of a sudden just break down camp and, get the hell out of Dodge. And they're like, where are you going? There's a werewolf in camp. why are they getting excited about that now? Bela's been traveling with them.
Maybe that's why they're nomadic. Everywhere they go, a werewolf happens to be around.
There's a new werewolf, yeah. So let's introduce the remake, and we'll bring that into the mix, and then we can kind of talk about that for a minute, and then cross-pollinate the two, and finish it up. So The Wolfman was a remake, which was directed by Joe Johnston, written by Andrew Kevin Walker and David Self, based, of course, on Kurt Siodmak's original screenplay for The Wolfman. It was a troubled production. Joe Johnston was not the first director. There was heavy studio involvement. And just to qualify, Dustin and I did watch the unrated cut, the director's cut that had 17 extra minutes in it, which, ironically, after we watched it, I thought, you could probably take 10 more minutes out.
But it also depends on which 10 minutes are taken out.
Exactly.
And given how a lot of films seem to cut out the character development, and if it's really studio heavy-handed, that seems to be more often what happens.
It's interesting with some director's cuts. Everyone thinks, oh, well, we just added, but you'll often find out that, like in Alien, for example, when Ridley Scott tinkered with it and made his, air quote, director's cut, he added footage, but he also took out footage. And there's a lot of directors who do that, right? Like they'll introduce new elements, but they understand that introducing new elements will upset sort of the rhythm or the flow of the story. They want to correct that while they're already like tinkering with it. It's not just a matter of, oh, well, this went here, clonk, like a piece of Lego or a square peg in a square hole. And I think that's something that could have been done with this movie if they were a little bit more
judicious.
Yeah. Because I think this one had some pacing issues in my mind. You said you didn't really feel that.
I did not feel the pacing issues. It almost felt more like a... Here's the thing. You've got the Wolfman. He's initially attacked, and then, of course, not too much is going to happen in the next month before the next full moon. So he's healing fast. The townsfolk are coming after him. One of the big differences is that here, they know he's the werewolf, like, right away. So he goes back to his dad's place. His dad's treating him, making sure nobody gets at him. All so that the next full moon, he can frame him for some murders.
Do you think he was actively trying to frame him, though? I thought he was just like, look, just embrace the beast.
I think he was actively trying to frame him.
Interesting. I didn't get that.
It could be in an attempt to do... Well, he let him loose. He locked him in the basement and then opened the door and said, go for it. Have fun.
Yeah, I thought that was him...
And then immediately afterwards, like, oh, you guys were right about my son. He's a werewolf.
But I think Talbot, played by Anthony Hopkins, very weirdly and interestingly, I think he was like drunk on power.
Oh, 100%. He finally got out and killed his own son. That's how his son died in this one. And so he frames the other son so that any suspicion is taken off of him, should there have been any, which apparently there was none. But then he also encourages his son to just embrace that side. He probably figured, we're both immortal now. No one can touch us. But get his son right into the violence, and the best way to do that would be to just throw him at the people.
That's what I figured. He locked himself in the room and was like, go forth. I don't know. I just felt that he was like sending him on his way, kind of like pushing the bird out of the nest, right? Letting him feel the power, feel the kill, and just really... hopefully embrace it.
I felt it was more of a hedging his bets, because he does point out that he didn't really respect his son until he goes and wolfs out.
I could go along with that, yeah.
So it's sort of either you're going to be like me and be awesome, or you're not going to be like me, and I'll just have the townspeople kill you and frame you for my murders, and I'm good. So he basically was set either way. To
be fair, he's super vague right up until the point where Larry challenges his father.
Oh, he's going nuts the whole time.
But he's like, he's supportive, but he's weird, and he, like you said, he kind of frames him, and he's like, yeah, he killed these people, whatever, but get off my land, because I can shoot you, right? Like, there's that weird interplay, and yeah, I don't know, maybe that was part of the pacing that I...
And that movie also dealt a lot with the duality. And
very much, yeah.
And because you had the father embracing it and the son resisting it, that really worked into the duality aspect.
There were things about the 2010 Wolfman that I thought I don't want to say corrected, because I don't necessarily think they were big problems in the original, but maybe improved on. Like, I liked setting it in the period that it was set in, taking it back to the past. I liked the way they handled Gwen and the brother, Ben. I liked the fact that, she was betrothed to him and he got killed. And there was that weird, like, Legends of the Fall thing going on with Emily Blunt and Anthony Hopkins and Benicio del Toro. A great cast for this movie, with the exception of maybe Hugo Weaving, who comes in and just starts chewing on scenery like it's a teething ring.
He's super weird in this film. As the police officer, it made little sense what he was doing half the time.
I wish they would have stuck with the idea of Captain Mentford, who was like the law in the town in the original film. But they had to bring in Francis Aberline from Scotland Yard, who has the connection to Jack the Ripper, and as everybody knows, like From Hell by Alan Moore, and there was the Johnny Depp movie with the Hughes brothers, and I don't know, it just created this weird interconnectivity that I wasn't really prepared for with this film. To have even a mention of Jack the Ripper, like just make it a Wolfman movie. You already got,
because all of a sudden it's like you've got the police officer with the troubled past. He's out to prove something. It's like this is too much, and it has nothing to do with anything going on here.
And you've already got the two werewolves and the mystery of who killed the son, and trying to figure out why Anthony Hopkins is acting like a batshit weirdo, trying to deal a little bit more psychologically with the whole idea of this werewolf and the mythology. And there's the idea of his mother being the gypsy and who killed his mother. Like, I thought a lot of this stuff was really interesting, and it really deepened the story and enriched it. But I also think it overcomplicated it in some ways.
There's definitely a few little threads that could have been dropped, in particular, as you said, the Hugo Weaving. One of the things that I definitely would have gotten rid of is all the jump scares.
Lots of jump scares. Holy crap.
The gore was great. Some of that stuff was very fun. The violent scenes were awesome. Like, I felt that they really shook things up. And yeah, like, you might talk about the pacing, but in between the full moons, you got a month where not as much is happening, certainly excitement-wise. But I felt that felt natural given what the movie's about. But the jump scares were out of place.
Considering this movie was already like a hard R, considering the gore was extensive
and spot on,
and they didn't really hide much. Like, there was so much blood and disemboweling and dismembering and grabbing people, ramming claws through the bottom of their jaw and coming out of their mouth, and like really, really graphic, artfully done. Not stuff that I'm used to seeing Joe Johnston do. But it's one of the things that I actually think is kind of glorious about this movie. It really revels. It's a very grand guignol kind of approach to the story, particularly with setting it back in the time it's set in. But yeah, there is quite a few just cheap amusement park
jump scares. And I mean, they work. You can have a few, but they became noticeable, especially when they started chaining into each other. And that's always just ridiculous.
I have an interesting relationship with these two movies in that the first one is clearly of its time, and it's a little flawed, but I still dig it. I still enjoy it, and I mean, it's shorter. It's much shorter. It's literally half the length of the movie in 2010. So, I mean, that's part of it too. And 2010, I like so much about it, but I find it really hard to like get my hooks in it. The two times I've tried watching it prior to this, I literally fell asleep for parts of it. And I've always wanted to like, well, I got to get back to it. And I almost fell asleep while watching it with you on the weekend for this recording.
Mike does watch his movies in chunks sometimes.
But there's something about this movie that just did not, like, it's a 2-hour movie. I don't know. It makes me want to keep going back to it to try and figure out like where's the glitch where I start to zone out. And I don't get that with the Siodmak Wolfman, the Wagoner.
Whereas I have zero problem staying awake and staying interested in this film. I also enjoyed in the remake, there was a number of callbacks to the original that made perfect sense. Talking about the cane that he killed Bela with in the first one, it was updated to a cane sword that also was made out of silver, which I appreciated. They got rid of the whole seeing pentagrams on your victim thing, which was kind of out of the blue and made no real sense to me. The whole connection to the devil was sort of removed.
The sword cane was a stroke of genius.
Sword cane was excellent.
And Max von Sydow giving him the sword cane. Like, if that was some of the minutes that were added in, keep those minutes in.
But other people preparing for the fights with the werewolves. The gypsies, when they were in town, they weren't the cause of anything. So I felt that fit a lot better with how they actually are historically. Their behavior didn't make no sense. I know that was terrible sentence structure. But one of the things that I always look at in most any film is, are the actions of the people, do they make sense? Bela's action does not make sense to be a werewolf who is giving somebody a fortune telling on a friggin' full moon. Like, come on, that's, you know exactly what's going down. Your wife knows what's going down. Are you that hard up for money? It's ridiculous. It's asinine. The fact that the engaged woman puts up at all with this creepy guy. I don't care what the social mores were like. I mean, come on. Say you're engaged and don't go outside at 8 p.m. Just go to bed, hang out with your friend. But I look at the remake and people's actions make sense. When he realizes he's the werewolf, he's trying to warn everybody. They think he's insane. They do the all sorts of medical torture that they used to do back in the day when anyone was crazy. And he's still just trying to warn them, right up to the point when he kills them all in the theater, which is great.
That's one of those things that I was torn with, because did they have to take it to London? I mean, it was great letting him loose in London. Even just to have that as kind of a weird sideways reference to Werewolf of London. Having him running around on the rooftops and like killing people and doing his thing, like that was cool. It also brought in, you see Gwen in London at the shop, which is a reference to the curio shop that they had in the town in the original. Like, so much stuff is just folded in and it's done super well. But at the same time, I'm looking at that London scene and thinking,
some of this feels like it was added in for the cheap thrills.
It's a little set piecey. Like, I feel like it could have been kept a little more provincial. It could have been a little more rural. Keep it in the town. Keep it where they are in Blackmoor. Like, unless they needed to just create a situation, because he walks back from London and it takes him forever.
But if somebody is that insane, do they have a sanitarium out in the middle of the boondocks? Or do you have to send your guy to London? Especially if you're rich like they were, you'd probably send them to the fancy one, which would be in London.
But I'm not saying it makes no sense narratively. I'm saying I think that might have been one of those things where they went big, and it might have been something that had they
it feels a
not
bit more,
gone there.
It feels a bit cheaper.
Yeah. They could have stuck with the atmosphere. They could have kept it more provincial, like I said. You know, what you say makes absolute sense. Andrew Kevin Walker's writing is quite good. He does such a good job of making all the callbacks he needs to, improving the things that he needs to without just completely, obliterating them from the script because they were silly or something. He finds a way to make so many things work and introduce new ideas and contemporize the whole thing. But I just feel like maybe it needed to be cut a little more, a little tighter. But considering how this was a troubled production, the music alone, Danny Elfman had scored the entire film, and then the studio cut it up. Danny Elfman was busy doing other things, and his music didn't fit the movie anymore. So they got a couple other guys to come in and kind of rejigger the score. So when you're actually watching the movie, I can't remember what the percentage is, but you're actually listening to more of the other dudes than you are of Danny Elfman. If you listen to the actual score album, you're listening to Danny Elfman's score. So I think just that story alone kind of tells you how troubled the movie was, and how the fact that it plays well at all is probably a really great thing. But I will point out about the music while I'm on the subject, I was a little bit disappointed because while I like Danny Elfman, he was very much calling back to Wojciech Kilar's Dracula score from the Francis Ford Coppola movie. And he has openly said that that was an influence on the music. And it's a little too on the nose for me. Anytime he quotes that Kilar score, it took me out of the movie. Otherwise, I think the music was well done.
Problems Mike has that Dustin does not. Huh? I don't remember the score. I didn't remember a lack of a score, which means it was doing its job, as far as I'm concerned.
I think probably the closest analog that people might understand for what went on with this movie. It was very much like a solo deal where Mark Romanek was actually developing the film. And because there was so much studio interference, he just kind of walked. And then Joe Johnston was brought in the way Ron Howard was kind of brought in. I'm not sure if Romanek actually shot anything. I don't think he did. So that's kind of the main difference. But like, it was a huge course correction. I want to like the 2010 version more than I do. I have my love for the 41 version, and I think it will be unchanging. It's fun. It's all the things that we said it was. But I struggle with the Benicio Wolfman. What did you think of Benicio? He kind of ran hot and cold to me.
I could agree. One of the things that I noticed, like, even though he was raised in America, that really made him stand out just having the American accent as opposed to an English one. And yeah, it was written that way, that he was schooled in America, so he wouldn't necessarily have an English accent, but it didn't feel natural. I've seen different accents in different films, but he felt out of place a lot of the time.
That amuses me because that was something I totally just bought into and was like, okay.
Whereas I was amused by your issues with the score that I just did not understand in here. And it might not have been entirely the accent, but just something about him that made him feel like he was out of place.
He very much is a big fan of the Universal Monsters movies and Lon Chaney, and I think he even has a little bit of Lon Chaney in his looks. So I think it was an interesting choice to bring Benicio in. I mean, he's a great actor too. I'm just not sure he nailed it. There was this weird kind of like laconic aspect to his character. There was sort of more going on there than there was with Lon Chaney's Larry Talbot, and it was elusive to me. Like it was a little slippery. I couldn't quite lock into it, whereas Lon Chaney was just Lon Chaney.
Well, I could definitely feel that he had much more issues with his family than Lon Chaney did. He didn't go to see his brother until, weeks later? It took him a ridiculously long time to even bother checking out his brother's death. And even then, he was still aggrieved by his father and just didn't put up with nothing. Lon Chaney, on the other hand, goes back home and everybody's just buddy-buddy, which is a lot more expected of the films of that time, where everyone's just standing around in a parlor and chatting it up. So you're going to get more depth out of the characters, and honestly that's something that I'm noticing having seen these first few films and some of the later ones as well, that the strength of the story is usually always going to be there, but the remake, making it more contemporary for the style of the day, I feel that's kind of beautiful. It works very well with a lot of these stories, and I have zero issue with it whatsoever, especially after 80 years. It really brings it into modern times, and they're able to, as you said, correct a lot of the things that were issues in the first one or things that don't make sense anymore. It turns it not necessarily any individual film into a masterpiece or even a classic. It turns the idea into a classic story that keeps getting retold, like any fable, like any folklore. And I think that's the strength of the Universal Monster movies and what I'm sort of leaning into as I'm watching these.
Just before we do our wrap-up, I want to address one thing with this film that I think is important, and that is the Wolfman himself, the makeup. The original Lon Chaney makeup by Jack Pierce, and the new werewolf makeup by Rick Baker, which I actually dig the old Wolfman. I prefer the Werewolf of London makeup, but the old Lon Chaney Wolfman, I like it. I just don't dig kind of the fro he's got going. He's got some seriously coiffed hair there. The Rick Baker makeup on Benicio del Toro I thought was spectacular in how it went more feral but was still honoring so much that original Jack Pierce makeup, and he was instantly recognizable as like the classic Wolfman, and you could just tell that it's been tweaked. What did you think of the Wolfman makeups between the two?
I couldn't bring to mind an image of either one if you put a gun to my head right now.
All right.
I'm just making stuff up over all the images of Wolfman that I've seen over the years. I did like the change in Lon Chaney, though, how I immediately thought, man, it's nice to see leading male actors who aren't ripped like the Wolverine, who aren't cutting water for a week before this one scene. It's just some regular average guy. But then they did the slow change on him seeing all the hair just suddenly appearing. I thought they did that fairly well.
I agree. I'm laughing because I'm remembering Lon Chaney's very average physique.
I appreciate the average physique because
I
guess
do
what?
as well.
Average people are average.
You don't have to be cut like Jackman to be a Wolfman. It's fair enough.
And at the end of the day, I think the real strength of these films, this folklore set, this mythology, is its focus on psychology and the duality of man as opposed to whatever the heck Dracula was supposed to be about.
I forgot to mention, you brought up the duality of man thing. Originally, the original idea behind the Wolfman, the 41 Wolfman, was that the only time you saw the beast was when Lon Chaney would be looking in a mirror at himself.
And that would have been super interesting.
And they tried to make it a question of, is he or isn't he? And it was kind of supposed to be up to the audience. I think they wanted to go the monster route, so that's the way they went. But Val Lewton stole the idea and went and made Cat People, and obviously that's considered a masterpiece, so the idea works. But they do address that in the 2010 because he's talking to the doctor and he's asking the doctor, like, do you think? And he's like, well, there is the different personalities and things can happen and whatever. Don't necessarily believe in werewolves, but whereas in the original, everyone's just kind of like, werewolf.
And at the same time, in the remake, all the townspeople are like, nope, werewolf, gotta kill him. Of course, back in the day, that's what you do. You get a mob up, you burn somebody at a stake, like that's Saturday evening, right?
Oh, and one last thing I want to mention before... Hey, there's things, man. In the original film, they had a bear, and the bear apparently didn't work out. It was, I think, a little rowdy. It scared some of the actors. They had some trouble controlling it. So they were like, you know what? Not worth it. Cut out the bear. They only had so much time to make the movie. I think they shot it in like 3 weeks, the original. There's a bear in the remake. Andrew Kevin Walker, he took the bear, he brought the bear in. They actually make the bear like a plot point because everyone initially thinks the bear that the gypsies have is killing people because they're like animal maulings. So they come to the gypsies and they're like, we need the bear, give us the bear. And I kind of love the fact that they're like, what? He dances. That's all he does. He's not, he can't attack anybody. And it was like a behind the scenes Easter egg. Like you see that and you're like, oh, I know what that is. So I just wanted to call that out for anybody who hasn't seen that or didn't know that and
might think it interesting.
Which
I'd hope is most of the audience.
So, as Dustin said at the end of the day, the Wolfman and the Wolfman, both interesting, both successful in their own rights in different ways.
Both worth a viewing.
We would love to hear what you guys think of the show. We're on all the social medias. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, no, we're not on Snapchat. What the hell else are we on? Twitter! Twitter's the big one. At FYC.
Spotify? Is that the S1 you were looking for?
It might have been. At FYC Show on Twitter, for your consideration, or FYC Show pretty much everywhere else. We are now officially on Spotify. If you guys want to hear us somewhere other than where you might be already listening to them, if that's somewhere that you listen to stuff, check us out there. Is it even iTunes anymore? Is it Apple Podcasts? I know they just did an update. I haven't done it yet. Apple Podcasts, while you're there, rate and review the show. Let us know what you think. 5 stars is everybody's preference, but go with your heart. And there's the blog, fycshow.wordpress.com. There's the Patreon, patreon.com/fycshow. If you want to support the show, like, share, follow, all that, social media jibber jab. And if you want to be a little bit more supportive, you can help us out financially, cover some of our hosting costs and technological things.
Not to get too fancy with the lingo.
Not too fancy, yeah. Helps keeps the lights on and helps Dustin and I put a little bit more energy into putting this stuff together, which we kind of dig, and if you're listening, we think you probably dig too. So whatever you can afford, if just sharing us on Facebook is what you can do, then awesome. Please do that. Yeah, so next week we are covering Frankenstein and Victor Frankenstein. Because
who's not the same Frankenstein, because Henry was the first Frankenstein. That's your spoiler for the day, that I've already seen it.
But Dustin, why are we doing Victor Frankenstein? Because it's not technically a Universal film.
It's not technically a Universal film, but their latest Universal Frankenstein film had them meeting Abbott and Costello, which we feel is a little bit old.
Still an excellent film, I will say.
Whereas the other Frankensteins, like I, Frankenstein, are a little bit too much. He's a weird superhero fighting demons that has nothing to do with Frankenstein, so we're going with the thematic remake of the original, looking more so at Mary Shelley's ideas.
And Kenneth Branagh's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from the early 90s. We kind of like hummed and hawed over that and Victor Frankenstein, and we went with Victor Frankenstein because Branagh's film was a bit of a dumpster fire, and neither of us have seen Victor Frankenstein, and it's kind of supposed to be a modern retelling of the story. So that's really the only non-universal kind of exception that we're making over the course of this series, but it's our show, so it's our rules.
As I said, we're looking at the folklore of the stories, not necessarily the universal, even if it started with the universal dark universe in essence.
It's a musical journey. That is an esoteric rattle and hum reference that no one's going to get.
You got it, Mike, and that's what matters.
All right, so we're going to close up shop here before, if you haven't already turned us off. Join us next week for Frankenstein and Victor Frankenstein. Thank you so much for downloading and letting us into your ear holes. I have been your spooky host, Mike.
And I've been your fright-tastic host, Dustin.
Take care, and we'll see you next time on For Your Consideration.
Adios.
There's just patterns. I see patterns everywhere. Time is a flat circle, Dustin.
Somebody's a little bit on acid, so we're just going to ignore all this.